Okay, so this is some film of our storyteller who comes here throughout the year.
And this story goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a young girl called Margaret, and she lived in a great big castle. And when she looked out the castle window, she could look across the valley and past the woods and over the other hills, and on the other hills was a great big house. A house. And Margaret would sit in her window and look at the house, because she'd heard some stories about the big house over the valley, over the woods and up the hill.
Up the hill?
She'd heard that in that house there was a young man, a spirit. And sometimes if you went there and picked the roses, you could meet this spirit man. She didn't believe it. And one day, it was lovely and sunny just like today. And she thought, I'm going to the big house. So she ran down the valley, through the woods, up the hill, till she came to a big house. And the big house, there were some roses growing in the gardens. So she went into the gardens and she plucked a red rose. As soon as she plucked a red rose, a young man appeared beside her. He said, "Why are you plucking my roses? Taking them and breaking them at the stem?" And Maid Margaret said, "My father owns this house, therefore I can pick all the roses I like." And she plucked another. Well, the young man was quite taken with this young girl. This was quite amusing, he thought. And so they started to chat. And then they started to walk. And then they started to talk. And eventually, they walked and talked all day, until night came. And as night came, and the sun set, and the moon came up, the young man disappeared.
Where'd he go?
Said the young Margaret. Where's he gone? He's disappeared.
Maybe he
And then she felt a little bit afraid. So she ran back down the hill, and through the woods, and up the valley until she got back to the castle. And she ran in and she saw her father, who was a very wise man. And she said, Father, I've met a young man over in the big house, down the valley, through the trees and up the hill." He said, "That would be Carter's Hall. You've met Tam Lin." She said, "Oh, I think I want to meet him again. I have so much things to talk to him about." And the young man, who was very, very wise, he said, "You must go back and you must pluck another red rose." So the very next day, she woke up very early as the sun came up, and she ran back to Carter's Hall and she plucked one red rose.
And where was the young man?
Immediately beside her, the young man appeared. And he said, "Oh, I'm so glad you came back to see me. I enjoyed talking and walking with you so much yesterday." He said, "I'm so happy." And the young girl Margaret said, "I'm so happy too." And the young man said, "But I must tell you my story. Many, many years ago," he said, "I was a handsome young man who owned all of this land, Carter's Hall, the hills and the woods and the valley." He said, "I rode around on a big white horse, and all the people were very friendly, and we got on very well, and everybody was happy." He said, "But one day, as I was riding on my big white horse," he said, "I felt drowsy, and I started to fall asleep. And I fell off my horse and I fell to the ground. And when I woke up," he said, "who was looking down on me but the Fairy Queen." Fairy Queen. And the Fairy Queen took me for her own. And since that day, I could only appear at Carter's Hall, but at night I belong to the fairies." Said Margaret.
See, even the grown-ups get involved.
Yes, but it was. Once every 10 years, the fairies have to go and give a present to the devil himself. And that 10 years is coming up. And that present might be me. Said Margaret, how do we save you? How do we save you? Tamlin said, there's only one way to save me. He said, tonight there'll be a big parade. There'll be a big parade of fairies. And what you'll hear is the tink of big parade of fairies.
Big parade of fairies.
Yeah, exactly. And you'll hear as the horse's harness comes towards. What you need to do is hide in this big tree. And what will happen is, first we'll pass the black horse, next we'll pass the brown horse. But when you see the white horse, that will be me. When you see the white horse, jump up, pull me down, and hold on tight. Why? What will ever happen? Well, first, I will turn into a bear. Who made the bear sound last time? Make a bear sound. Then I'll turn into a lion. Who can make a lion sound? Make a lion sound? Louder? Perfect. Then I'll turn into a snake. And finally I'll turn into molten metal and you must chuck me into the river. And then I'll be free. Margaret said, right. Margaret. That night, Margaret hid in the tree trunk. And in the distance she heard. Louder and louder. First of all,
6.5 hours. Every time. Wait, no.
She caught Tamlin round the waist and she dragged him to the ground. Immediately he started to struggle and he turned into a bear, a terrifying, frightening bear. Terrifying and frightening. Really terrifying and frightening. That terrifying and frightening. No! Right. Then he turned into a lion with sharp claws that roared and sharp teeth that roared. Terrifying! That terrifying.
Is he yours?
No?
When you heard the voice, I know that one.
And then he turned into a snake, twisting and turning, holding on like she was holding on to butter. An evil, horrible big snake. And finally, he turned into molten metal. And she immediately threw him into the river. The river bubbled and steamed. And out the steam came young Tamlin. Oh! Immediately Margaret wrapped him in her cloak and hid him as the fairy queen. Cackled malically at the back in her woolly hat and crown. She cackled so loudly. She cackled so loudly. And she said, "Oh, Tamlin, this night, if I'd seen your plot, to would you'd be without your heart." And with a big flash and a bang, she disappeared. And all the fairy folk disappeared. And Tamlin was back in the human world again. Oh, they ran back down the hill, through the trees and up the valley until they reached the castle and they saw her father. And her father said, "You can go and live in Carter's Hall, for it's yours again now. And you can be married and live happily ever after. Because remember, the only thing that will set you free is love." And that's the story of Tamlin. They lived happily ever after. There you go.
Yay!
Right.